The pod had ceased to roll. The great red sun lay straight ahead. Though there was no sense of motion, Bowman knew that he was still gripped by whatever controlling force had brought him here from Saturn. All the science and engineering skill of Earth seemed hopelessly primitive now against the powers that were carrying him to some unimaginable fate. He stared into the sky ahead, trying to pick out the goal towards which he was being taken, perhaps some planet circling this great sun. But there was nothing that showed any visible disk or exceptional brightness. If there were planets orbiting here, he could not distinguish them from the stellar background. Then he noticed that something strange was happening on the very edge of this sun's crimson disk. A white glow had appeared there and was rapidly waxing in brilliance. He wondered if he was seeing one of those sudden eruptions or flares that trouble most stars from time to time. The light became brighter and bluer. It began to spread along the edge of the sun, whose blood-red hues paled swiftly by comparison. It was almost, Bowman told himself, smiling at the absurdity of the thought, as if he were watching sunrise on a sun. And so indeed he was. Above the burning horizon lifted something no larger than a star, but so brilliant that the eye could not bear to look upon it. A mere point of blue-white radiance, like an electric arc, was moving at unbelievable speed across the face of the great sun. It must be very close to its giant companion, for immediately below it, drawn upward by its gravitational pull, was a column of flame thousands of miles high. It was as if a tidal wave of fire was marching forever along the equator of this star in vain pursuit of the searing apparition in its sky. That pinpoint of incandescence must be a white dwarf, one of those strange, fierce little stars, no larger than the Earth, yet containing 1,000,000 times its mass. Such ill-matched stellar couples were not uncommon, but Bowman had never dreamed that one day he would see such a pair with his own eyes. The white dwarf had transited almost half the disk of its companion. It must take only minutes to make its complete orbit, when Bowman was at last certain that he too was moving. Ahead of him, one of the stars was becoming rapidly brighter, and was beginning to drift against its background. It must be some small, close body, perhaps the world towards which he was traveling. It was upon him with unexpected speed, and he saw that it was not a world at all. A dully gleaming cobweb or lattice-work of metal, hundreds of miles in extent, grew out of nowhere until it filled the sky. Scattered across its continent-wide surface were structures that must have been as large as cities, but which appeared to be machines. Around many of these were assembled scores of smaller objects, ranged in neat rows and columns. Bowman had passed several such groups before he realized that they were fleets of spaceships. He was flying over a gigantic orbital parking lot. Because there were no familiar objects by which he could judge the scale of the scene flashing by below, it was almost impossible to estimate the size of the vessels hanging there in space. But they were certainly enormous. Some must have been miles in length. They were of many different designs: spheres, faceted crystals, slim pencils, ovoid discs. This must be one of the meeting places for the commerce of the stars. Or it had been, perhaps 1,000,000 years ago. For nowhere could Bowman see any sign of activity. This sprawling spaceport was as dead as the moon. He knew it not only by the absence of all movement, but by such unmistakable signs as great gaps torn in the metal cobweb by the wasp-like blunderings of asteroids that must have smashed through it aeons ago. This was no longer a parking lot. It was a cosmic junk heap. He had missed its builders by ages, and with that realization Bowman felt a sudden sinking of his heart. Though he had not known what to expect, at least he had hoped to meet some intelligence from the stars. Now, it seemed, he was too late. He had been caught in an ancient automatic trap, set for some unknown purpose, and still operating when its makers had long since passed away. It had swept him across the galaxy and dumped him, with how many others, in this celestial Sargasso, doomed soon to die when his air was exhausted. Well, it was unreasonable to expect more. Already he had seen wonders for which many men would have sacrificed their lives. He thought of his dead companions. He had no cause for complaint. Then he saw that the derelict spaceport was still sliding past him with undiminished speed. He was sweeping over its outlying suburbs. Its ragged edge went by, and no longer partly eclipsed the stars. In a few more minutes it had fallen behind. His fate did not lie here, but far ahead, in the huge crimson sun, towards which the space pod was now unmistakably falling. Now there was only the red sun, filling the sky from side to side. He was so close that its surface was no longer frozen into immobility by sheer scale. There were luminous nodules moving to and fro, cyclones of ascending and descending gas, prominences slowly rocketing towards the heavens. Slowly? They must be rising at 1,000,000 miles an hour for their movement to be visible to his eye. He did not even attempt to grasp the scale of the inferno towards which he was descending. The immensities of Saturn and Jupiter had defeated him during Discovery's flyby in that solar system now unknown megamiles away. But everything he saw here was 100 times larger still. He could do nothing but accept the images that were flooding into his mind without attempting to interpret them. As that sea of fire expanded beneath him, Bowman should have known fear, but, curiously enough, he now felt only a mild apprehension. It was not that his mind was benumbed with wonders. Logic told him that he must surely be under the protection of some controlling and almost omnipotent intelligence. He was now so close to the red sun that he would have been burned up in a moment if its radiation had not been held at bay by some invisible screen. And during his voyage, he had been subject to accelerations that should have crushed him instantly, yet he had felt nothing. If so much trouble had been taken to preserve him, there was still cause for hope. The space pod was now moving along a shallow arc, almost parallel to the surface of the star, but slowly descending towards it. And now, for the first time, Bowman became aware of sounds. There was a faint, continuous roar, broken from time to time by crackles like tearing paper or distant lightning. This could be only the feeblest echo of an unimaginable cacophony. The atmosphere surrounding him must be racked by concussions that would tear any material object to atoms. Yet he was protected from this shattering tumult as effectively as from the heat. Though ridges of flame, thousands of miles high, were rising and slowly collapsing around him, he was completely insulated from all this violence. The energies of the star raved past him, as if they were in another universe. The pod moved sedately through their mist, unbuffeted and unscorched. Bowman's eyes, no longer hopelessly confused by the strangeness and grandeur of the scene, began to pick out details which must have been there before, but which he had not yet perceived. The surface of this star was no formless chaos. There was pattern here, as in everything that nature created. He noticed first the little whirlpools of gas, probably no larger than Africa or Asia, that wandered over the surface of the star. Sometimes he could look directly down into one of them to see darker, cooler regions far below. Curiously enough, there appeared to be no sunspots. Perhaps they were a disease peculiar to the star that shone on Earth. And there were occasional clouds, like wisps of smoke blown before a gale. Perhaps they were indeed smoke, for this sun was so cold that real fire could exist here. Chemical compounds could be born and could live for a few seconds before they were again ripped apart by the fiercer nuclear violence that surrounded them. The horizon was growing brighter, its color changing from gloomy red to yellow to blue to blistering violet. The white dwarf was coming up over the horizon, dragging its tidal wave of star stuff behind it. Bowman shielded his eyes from the intolerable glare of the little sun and focused on the troubled starscape which its gravitational field was sucking skyward. Once he had seen a waterspout moving across the face of the Caribbean. This tower of flame had almost the same shape, only the scale was slightly different, for at its base the column was probably wider than the planet Earth. And then, immediately beneath him, Bowman noticed something which was surely new, since he could hardly have overlooked it if it had been there before. Moving across the ocean of glowing gas were myriads of bright beads. They shone with a pearly light which waxed and waned in a period of a few seconds, and they were all traveling in the same direction, like salmon moving upstream. Sometimes they weaved back and forth so that their paths intertwined, but they never touched. There were thousands of them, and the longer Bowman stared, the more convinced he became that their motion was purposeful. They were too far away for him to make out any details of their structure. That he could see them at all in this colossal panorama meant that they must be scores, perhaps hundreds, of miles across. If they were organized entities, they were leviathans indeed, built to match the scale of the world they inhabited. Perhaps they were only clouds of plasma, given temporary stability by some odd combination of natural forces, like the short-lived spheres of ball lightning that still puzzled terrestrial scientists. That was an easy and perhaps soothing explanation, but as Bowman looked down upon that star-wide streaming, he could not really believe it. Those glittering nodes of light knew where they were going. They were deliberately converging upon the pillar of fire raised by the white dwarf as it orbited overhead. Bowman stared once more at that ascending column, now marching along the horizon beneath the tiny, massive star that ruled it. Could it be pure imagination, or were there patches of brighter luminosity creeping up that great geyser of gas, as if myriads of shining sparks had combined into whole continents of phosphorescence? The idea was almost beyond fantasy, but perhaps he was watching nothing less than a migration from star to star across a bridge of fire. Whether it was a movement of mindless cosmic beasts driven across space by some lemming-like urge, or a vast concourse of intelligent entities, he would probably never know. He was moving through a new order of creation of which few men had ever dreamed. Beyond the realms of sea and land and air and space lay the realms of fire, which he alone had been privileged to glimpse. It was too much to expect that he would also understand. The pillar of fire was marching over the edge of the sun like a storm passing beyond the horizon. The scurrying flecks of light no longer moved across the redly glowing starscape, still thousands of miles below. Inside his space pod, protected from an environment that could annihilate him within a millisecond, David Bowman awaited whatever had been prepared. The white dwarf was sinking fast as it hurtled along its orbit. Presently it touched the horizon, set it aflame, and disappeared. A false twilight fell upon the inferno beneath, and in the sudden change of illumination, Bowman became aware that something was happening in the space around him. The world of the red sun seemed to ripple, as if you were looking at it through running water. For a moment he wondered if this was some refractive effect, perhaps caused by the passage of an unusually violent shock wave through the tortured atmosphere in which he was immersed. The light was fading. It seemed that a second twilight was about to fall. Involuntarily, Bowman looked upward, then checked himself sheepishly, as he remembered that here the main source of light was not the sky, but the blazing world below. It seemed as if walls of some material like smoked glass were thickening around him, cutting out the red glow and obscuring the view. It became darker and darker. The faint roar of the stellar hurricanes also faded out. The space pod was floating in silence and in night. A moment later, there was the softest of bumps as it settled on some hard surface and came to rest. To rest on what? Bowman asked himself incredulously. Then light returned, and incredulity gave way to a heart-sinking despair. For as he saw what lay around him, he knew that he must be mad. He was prepared, he had thought, for any wonder. The only thing he had never expected was the utterly commonplace. The space pod was resting on the polished floor of an elegant, anonymous hotel suite that might have been in any large city on Earth. He was staring into a living room with a coffee table, a divan, a dozen chairs, a writing desk, various lamps, a half-full bookcase with some magazines lying on it, and even a bowl of flowers. Van Gogh's Bridget Owls was hanging on one wall, Wyeth's Christiana's World on another. He felt confident that when he pulled open the drawer of that desk, he would find a Gideon Bible inside it. If he was indeed mad, his delusions were beautifully organized. Everything was perfectly real. Nothing vanished when he turned his back. The only incongruous element in the scene, and that's certainly a major one, was the space pod itself. For many minutes, Bowman did not move from his seat. He half expected the vision around him to go away, but it remained as solid as anything he had ever seen in his life. It was real, or else a phantom of the senses, so superbly contrived that there was no way of distinguishing it from reality. Perhaps it was some kind of test. If so, not only his fate, but that of the human race might well depend upon his actions in the next few minutes. He could sit here and wait for something to happen, or he could open the pod and step outside to challenge the reality of the scene around him. The floor appeared to be solid. At least it was bearing the weight of the space pod. He was not likely to fall through it, whatever it might really be. But there was still the question of air. For all that he could tell, this room might be in a vacuum, or might contain a poisonous atmosphere. He thought it very unlikely. No one would go to all this trouble without attending to such an essential detail. But he did not propose to take unnecessary risks. In any event, his years of training made him wary of contamination. He was reluctant to expose himself to an unknown environment until he knew that there was no alternative. This place looked like a hotel room somewhere in the United States. That did not alter the fact that in reality he must be hundreds of light years from the solar system. He closed the helmet of his suit, sealing himself in, and actuated the hatch of the space pod. There was a brief hiss of pressure equalization, then he stepped out into the room. As far as he could tell, he was in a perfectly normal gravity field. He raised one arm, then let it fall freely. It flopped to his side in less than a second. That made everything seem doubly unreal. Here he was wearing a spacesuit, standing, when he should have been floating, outside a vehicle which could only function properly in the absence of gravity. All his normal astronaut's reflexes were upset. He had to think before he made every movement. Like a man in a trance, he walked slowly from his bare, unfurnished half of the room towards the hotel suite. It did not, as he had almost expected, disappear as he approached, but remained perfectly real and apparently perfectly solid. There were two doors that opened readily enough. The first one took him into a small but comfortable bedroom, fitted with a bed, bureau, 2 chairs, light switches that actually worked, and a clothes closet. He opened this and found himself looking at 4 suits, a dressing gown, a dozen white shirts, and several sets of underwear, all neatly draped from hangers. Without further hesitation, he walked into the bedroom and began to undo the clamp of his helmet. When it was loose, he lifted the helmet a fraction of an inch, cracked the seal, and took a cautious sniff. As far as he could tell, he was breathing perfectly normal air. He dropped the helmet on the bed and began thankfully and rather stiffly to divest himself of his suit. When he had finished, he stretched, took a few deep breaths, and carefully hung the spacesuit up among the more conventional articles of clothing in the closet. It looked rather odd there that the compulsive tidiness that Bowman shared with all astronauts would never have allowed him to leave it anywhere else. He had learned all that he wished to for the moment. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, yet it seemed impossible that one could sleep in such fantastic surroundings and further from Earth than any man in history had ever been. But the comfortable bed and the instinctive wisdom of the body conspired together against his will. He fumbled for the light switch, and the room was plunged into darkness. Within seconds, he had passed beyond the reach of dreams. So, for the last time, David Bowman slept. There being no further use for it, the furniture of the suite dissolved back into the mind of its creator. Only the bed remained, and the walls, shielding this fragile organism from the energies it could not yet control. In his sleep, David Bowman stirred restlessly. He did not wake, nor did he dream, but he was no longer wholly unconscious. Like a fog creeping through a forest, something invaded his mind. He sensed it only dimly, for the full impact would have destroyed him as surely as the fires raging beyond these walls. Beneath that dispassionate scrutiny, he felt neither hope nor fear. All emotion had been leached away. He seemed to be floating in free space, while around him stretched, in all directions, an infinite geometrical grid of dark lines or threads, along which moved tiny nodes of light, some slowly, some at dazzling speed. Once he had peered through a microscope at a cross-section of a human brain, and in its network of nerve fibers had glimpsed the same labyrinthine complexity. But that had been dead and static, whereas this transcended life itself. He knew, or believed he knew, that he was watching the operation of some gigantic mind, contemplating the universe of which he was so tiny a part. The vision, or illusion, lasted only a moment. Then the crystalline planes and lattices, and the interlocking perspectives of moving light, flickered out of existence, as David Bowman moved into a realm of consciousness that no man had experienced before. At first, it seemed that time itself was running backward. Even this marvel he was prepared to accept, before he realized a subtler truth. The springs of memory were being tapped. In controlled recollection, he was reliving the past. There was the hotel suite, there the space pod, there the burning starscapes of the red sun, there the shining core of the galaxy, there the gateway to which he had re-emerged into the universe. And not only vision, but all the sense impressions and all the emotions he had felt at the time were racing past more and more swiftly. His life was unreeling, like a tape recorder playing back at ever-increasing speed. Now he was once more aboard the Discovery, and the rings of Saturn filled the sky. Before that, he was repeating his final dialogue with Hal. He was seeing Frank Poole leave on his last mission. He was hearing the voice of Earth, assuring him that all was well. And even as he relived these events, he knew that all indeed was well. He was retrogressing down the corridors of time, being drained of knowledge and experience as he swept backward towards his childhood. But nothing was being lost. All that he had ever been, at every moment of his life, was being transferred to safer keeping. Even as one David Bowman ceased to exist, another became immortal. Faster, faster, he moved back into forgotten years and into a simpler world. The faces he had once loved and had thought lost beyond recall smiled at him sweetly. He smiled back with fondness and without pain. Now, at last, the headlong aggression was slackening. The wells of memory were nearly dry. Time flowed more and more sluggishly, approaching a moment of stasis, as a swinging pendulum, at the limit of its arc, seems frozen for one eternal instant before the next cycle begins. The timeless instant passed. The pendulum reversed its swing. In an empty room, floating amid the fires of a double star 20,000 light-years from Earth, a baby opened its eyes and began to cry. Then it became silent, as it saw that it was no longer alone. A ghostly, glimmering rectangle had formed in the empty air. It solidified into a crystal tablet, lost its transparency, and became suffused with a pale, milky luminescence. Tantalizing, ill-defined phantoms moved across its surface and in its depths. They coalesced into bars of lights and shadow, then formed intermeshing, spoked patterns that began slowly to rotate, in time with a pulsing rhythm that now seemed to fill the whole of space. It was a spectacle to grasp and hold the attention of any child or of any man-ape. But, as it had been 3 million years before, it was only the outward manifestation of forces too subtle to be consciously perceived. It was merely a toy to distract the senses, while the real processing was carried out at far deeper levels of the mind. This time the processing was swift and certain, as the new design was woven. For in the aeons since their last meeting, much had been learned by the weaver, and the material on which he practiced his art was now an infinitely finer texture. But whether it should be permitted to form part of his still growing tapestry, only the future could tell. With eyes that already held more than human intentness, the baby stared into the depths of the crystal monolith, seeing, but not yet understanding, the mysteries that lay beyond. It knew that it had come home, that here was the origin of many races besides its own, but it knew also that it could not stay. Beyond this moment lay another birth, stranger than any in the past. Now the moment had come. The glowing patterns no longer echoed the secrets in the crystal's heart. As they died, so too the protective walls faded back into the non-existence from which they had briefly emerged, and the red sun filled the sky. The metal and plastic of the forgotten space pod, and the clothing once worn by an entity who had called himself David Bowman, flashed into flame. The last links with Earth were gone, resolved back into their component atoms. But the child scarcely noticed, as he adjusted himself to the comfortable glow of his new environment. He still needed, for a little while, this shell of matter as the focus of his powers. His indestructible body was his mind's present image of itself, and for all his powers, he knew that he was still a baby. So he would remain until he had decided on a new form, or had passed beyond the necessities of matter. And now it was time to go, though in one sense he would never leave this place where he had been reborn, for he would always be part of the entity that used this double star for its unfathomable purposes. The direction, though not the nature, of his destiny was clear before him, and there was no need to trace the devious path by which he had come. With the instincts of 3 million years, he now perceived that there were more ways than one behind the back of space. The ancient mechanisms of the Stargate had served him well, but he would not need them again. The glimmering rectangular shape that had once seemed no more than a slab of crystal, still floated before him, indifferent as he was to the harmless flames of the inferno beneath. It encapsulated yet unfathomed secrets of space and time, but some at least he now understood and was able to command. How obvious, how necessary was that mathematical ratio of its sides, the quadratic sequence 1, 4, 9. And how naive to have imagined that the series ended at this point, in only 3 dimensions. He focused his mind upon these geometrical simplicities, and as his thoughts brushed against it, the empty framework filled with the darkness of the interstellar night. The glow of the red sun faded, or rather, seemed to recede in all directions at once, and there before him was the luminous whirlpool of the galaxy. It might have been some beautiful, incredibly detailed model embedded in a block of plastic, but it was the reality, grasped as a whole with senses no more subtle than vision. If he wished, he could focus his attention upon any one of its 100 billion stars, and he could do much more than that. Here he was, adrift in this great river of suns, halfway between the banked fires of the galactic core and the lonely, scattered sentinel stars of the rim. And here he wished to be, on the far side of this chasm in the sky, this serpentine band of darkness, empty of all stars. He knew that this formless chaos, visible only by the glow that limned its edges from fire mists far beyond, was the still unused stuff of creation, the raw material of evolutions yet to be. Here time had not begun. Not until the suns that now burned were long since dead would light and life reshape this void. Unwittingly he had crossed it once. Now he must cross it again, this time of his own volition. The thought filled him with a sudden freezing terror, so that for a moment he was wholly disorientated, and his new vision of the universe trembled and threatened to shatter into 1,000 fragments. It was not fear of the galactic gulfs that chilled his soul, but a more profound disquiet, stemming from the unborn future. For he had left behind the time scales of his human origin. Now, as he contemplated that band of starless night, he knew the first intimations of the eternity that yawned before him. Then he remembered that he would never again be alone, and his panic slowly ebbed. The crystal-clear perception of the universe was restored to him, not, he knew, wholly by his own efforts. When he needed guidance in his first faltering steps, it would be there. Confident once more, like a high diver who had regained his nerve, he launched himself across the light years. The galaxy burst forth from the mental frame in which he had enclosed it. Stars and nebulae poured past him in an illusion of infinite speed. Phantom suns exploded and fell behind as he slipped like a shadow through their cores. The cold, dark waste of cosmic dust, which he had once feared, seemed no more than the beat of a raven's wing across the face of the sun. The stars were thinning out. The glare of the Milky Way was dimming into a pale ghost of the glory he had known, and, when he was ready, would know again. He was back, precisely where he wished to be, in the space that men called real. There before him, a glittering toy no star child could resist, floated the planet Earth with all its peoples. He had returned in time. Down there on that crowded globe, the alarms would be flashing across the radar screens. The great tracking telescopes would be searching the skies, and history, as men knew it, would be drawing to a close. 1,000 miles below, he became aware that a slumbering cargo of death had awoken and was stirring sluggishly in its orbit. The feeble energies it contained were no possible menace to him, but he preferred a cleaner sky. He put forth his will, and the circling megatons flowered in the silent detonation that brought a brief false dawn to half a sleeping globe. Then he waited, marshalling his thoughts and brooding over his still untested powers. For though he was master of the world, he was not quite sure what to do next. But he would think of something.